I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear concern. I heard laughter. I was lying on the porch, one wrist bent beneath me, breath caught in my throat. Pain shooting up my side like fire. He laughed. Not the kind of laugh that slips out when someone's startled. Not the nervous laugh that follows shock. It was cold, sharp, short. As if my fall had confirmed something he already believed. That I was fragile. That I was fading. That I was ... the porch I had swept every Sunday. The steps I had scrubbed by hand. Now a stage for humiliation. And his chuckle. The curtain falling. He did help me up eventually. With slow hands and an expression too neutral to be guilt. But something broke before the bruise even formed. And once you hear someone laugh when you're in pain, you can't unhear it later. I sat in the kitchen with ice on my wrist, watching him joke with my daughter. I didn't speak. I watched. And I realized something had shifted. Family used to mean safety, warmth, home. Now I was something to be managed. A liability in their living room. An aging shadow in their new life. I wanted to believe I was overreacting. But instincts don't lie. And that laugh. It echoed louder than any scream ever could, so I wrapped the ice tighter and started paying closer attention. Because sometimes the quietest betrayals start with the smallest sounds. And sometimes laughter doesn't mean joy. Sometimes. It's a warning. If you've ever been laughed at when you needed love, stay with me. When my husband died, I didn't have time to mourn the way others did. No long days in bed. No casseroles dropped off by concerned neighbors. No family meetings about what came next. What came next was bills. What came next was a daughter with wide eyes and an empty seat at the dinner table. What came next was survival. James passed in late spring. When the lilacs were blooming by the fence and the air still smelled of earth after the rain. He collapsed in the garage halfway through fixing the mower. One moment he was humming, the next he was gone. Just like that, our plans. Our routines, our shared glances over morning coffee all dissolved into silence. I buried him on a Monday. On Tuesday, I applied for work. 2 jobs. Then 3. The first was at a bakery, 4 a.m. shifts. Flour in my hair, kneading dough while the world still slept. The second was cleaning offices at night, where I scrubbed toilets and emptied trash in heels to warn to complain. The third came later weekends spent sewing buttons, hemming pants. Fixing whatever others didn't want to throw away just yet. I kept my husband's toolbox under the bed. And his voice in my head, "You were always the strong one. Mary, don't let this world knock you down." I didn't. Not for my sake, but for hers. My daughter was only 6. Too young to understand where her father went. Old enough to miss him in the creak of the stairs and the way I paused before saying grace. I worked until my hands cracked and my feet bled. We lived in a rented 2-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and a leaky faucet. But I never let her see me cry. Not once. At night, I whispered bedtime stories that I made up, tales of queens with tired eyes and golden hearts who built castles out of broken bricks. That was always my dream. A home. Not just a roof, but a place that belonged to us. A kitchen where we could bake without worrying about the landlord. A front porch where she could swing her legs and count stars without curfews. So I saved every penny, every tip, every spare dollar folded and tucked into an envelope marked someday, when I finally had enough for a tiny plot of land on the edge of town. I didn't buy furniture. I bought cement. I didn't call contractors, I called in favors. The retired vet from church taught me how to mix mortar. A woman I met at the laundromat helped me with insulation in exchange for mending her winter coat. We built that house slowly, brick by blistered brick. I hammered. I painted. I've sanded. I burned through gloves, tore through jeans, and learned that the ache in your lower back is a sign that progress is being made. The house wasn't much by anyone else's standards. 1 floor, 2 bedrooms, a roof that leaked the first year because I misaligned the shingles. But it was ours. I remember the night we moved in. We didn't even have beds yet, just sleeping bags and a heater that groaned louder than it warmed. We sat on the floor and ate canned soup. She looked up at me with the widest smile and said, "Mom, is this what it's like to be rich?" I laughed and cried at the same time. Because 2MIT was rich in peace, rich in dignity, rich in the kind of pride that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. I planted a rose bush outside, next to the porch. James loved roses. It bloomed the next spring fierce and bright, like it knew who it was blooming for. Over the years, that house became my everything. It saw birthday cakes and scraped knees. It heard lullabies and arguments and apologies whispered through closed doors. It sheltered us through tornado warnings and ice storms and the kind of grief that clings to wallpaper like smoke. It was the only thing I owned. And the only thing I truly trusted. I paid it off 10 years later. I framed the final mortgage statement and hung it above the kitchen table. I didn't buy a new car. I didn't take a vacation. I bought curtains that I had sewn myself and finally replaced the creaky doorknob with one that didn't rattle every time the wind blew. The house was never just a house. It was my sanctuary, my reward, my proof that I hadn't just survived, I had built something. With grit, with tears, with hands that once held grief but now held triumph. And for years it stayed that way. A quiet, unspoken agreement between the walls and me, until suddenly it wasn't. Until glances turned cold. Until Mom's place became the property. Until the porch where I once rocked my daughter to sleep became the place. I fell in, someone laughed. They didn't see the history. They didn't feel the ghosts of joy and struggle lingering in the air. They just saw square footage. A potential listing equity. I didn't just pour money into that house. I poured my life into it. My pain, my love, my everything. And now that everything was being eyed like a piece of meat on the butcher's counter, the place I once called my haven was becoming a target. The same daughter I once cradled through chickenpox now let her husband call my home a financial opportunity. They thought I was too old to fight back, too tired to notice, too sentimental to act. But they forgot who built that house. They forgot who buried her grief in its foundation, who stayed awake counting pennies so her child could have a pillow and a dream. They forgot that a house built from love doesn't crumble easy, not without a fight. And I wasn't done fighting. I used to believe that love, especially between a mother and her daughter, was unshakable. That no matter how far life drifted us apart, the thread between us would always hold. But sometimes love isn't broken all at once. Sometimes it's chipped away smile by smile, silence by silence, until you look up one day and realize the person you loved is standing on the other side of a closed door. It started when Claire met Nathan. He was charming, no doubt. Polished in the way men can be when they know they're being watched. He shook my hand firmly the first time he visited, brought flowers that didn't quite match the vase I offered, and complimented my cooking like it was part of a script. Still, I smiled. Claire's eyes sparkled when she looked at him, and that was enough for me. The wedding was small but lovely. I baked the cake myself, vanilla with lemon curd, just like Claire liked when she was little. We danced, we cried. We toasted. I remember hugging her tightly that night, whispering, "No matter what changes, you'll always be my girl." She smiled, but her arms didn't wrap around me quite as tight at first. I chalked up the distance to newlywed life. Of course, they were busy. Of course, they were nesting. She used to call every evening, quick chats while dinner simmered or while she folded laundry. After the wedding, those calls became once a week. Then every other, then sometimes not at all. When I'd call, she'd sound rushed, distracted. "Oh, sorry, Mom, we're just heading out." Or, "Nathan's on a call, Can I ring you back?" But the callbacks never came. Then the visits started to feel polite, not warm. They'd come by, but it felt like a courtesy, like checking off an errand. Claire stopped opening the fridge like she owned the place. Nathan stopped asking how I was sleeping. They sat on the couch like guests, not family. I started setting fewer plates out of habit. Still, I held on. I baked her favorite pie. I dusted the guest room. I told myself it was just a phase, but it wasn't. I'll never forget the first time she called our home the property. We were standing in the kitchen, her kitchen, once upon a time, and I'd just made tea. She looked out the window, watching Nathan measure the porch steps with his phone out, and said, "You know, the property would really shine with a new deck." I blinked. "The property?" She glanced at me, unbothered. "It's just what Nathan calls it. Don't take it personally." But how could I not? I had built this house after her father died, with scraped-together paychecks and coupon clippings. Every inch of this place held a memory, a milestone, a moment we survived together. And now it was a nameless parcel to be improved. I didn't argue. I just sipped my tea and listened to the sound of something sacred being reduced to square footage. Then came the red flag I couldn't ignore. They arrived one Sunday with a folder. Nothing formal, just a manila envelope tucked under Nathan's arm like it was nothing more than a recipe. We'd just finished lunch and Claire was clearing the plates when he pulled it out and said, "Mary, we wanted to ask you something." I looked at Claire. She avoided my eyes. Nathan slid the envelope across the table. "We're applying for a small business loan. Just a little push to get our dream off the ground. The bank suggested if we had some collateral, it'd speed things up. We thought we hoped you might co-sign using the house." My mouth went dry. "The house?" I asked, "just on paper," he said quickly. "No actual risk to you. It's temporary. Strictly legalese." Claire stepped in. "It would mean the world, Mom. You know, we'd never let anything happen to the house. But that was the problem. It wasn't the house. It was my home." My eyes dropped to the folder. I didn't open it. My fingers hovered above the edge, but something in me, something maternal, something primal pulled back. "I'll have to think about it," I said softly. Nathan's smile tightened. Claire looked relieved, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't gratitude. It was anticipation. Like she already knew I'd cave. Like this was just step one in a longer plan. That night, I sat on the porch long after they'd left. The air smelled like wet earth and fading jasmine. I rocked slowly, the creak of the wood beneath me, whispering a truth I didn't want to face. They didn't see me anymore. Not as a mother. Not as a person. Not even as a homeowner. I was a signature, a stepping stone, a formality. But I wasn't ready to be erased. I didn't sign. I told them I needed more time, and they smiled like that was okay. But I saw it. The flicker in Nathan's eyes. The mild disappointment in Claire's voice. That was the moment I realized I hadn't just lost my daughter to marriage. I lost her to strategy, and in trying to build a new future, she was tearing mine apart. It happened on a Tuesday. The wind had been sharp all morning, biting through the cracks in the window panes, rattling the wind chimes like a warning bell I didn't know how to read. I stepped outside just after lunch to bring in the mail. The front porch had a light dusting of snow, more deceptive than deep. I'd made that walk 1,000 times, knew the steps like the back of my hand. But that day, my heel caught the ice, my feet slipped out from under me, and the world spun sideways. I landed hard. A sharp sting in my hip, elbows scraped, pride shattered louder than any bone could have been. For a moment, the air fled my lungs, and all I could hear was the dull throb of my pulse in my ears. Then dash laughter, not the kind that bubbles out of concern, not the shaky relief kind. The "oh my God, you're okay" kind. No, this was short, dry, almost amused. I turned my head and saw Nathan standing at the edge of the porch. He didn't move, didn't reach for me, didn't ask if I was hurt. He just smirked. "You all right there?" He said after a beat like I'd tripped on a word, not a stare. Claire came rushing out behind him. She dropped to her knees beside me, voice trembling, fussing over my jacket, brushing snow from my sleeves. But even as she checked my elbow, her eyes darted to Nathan, looking for cues. I saw it. I felt it. The balance had shifted. "I'm fine," I whispered, more out of defiance than truth. Later that evening, they insisted I stay seated while they handled dinner. I sat quietly in the living room, a heating pad on my hip and a pit growing in my stomach. The next morning, Something new had bloomed around the house. Cameras, tiny black orbs, affixed to the corners of the porch, above the door and by the driveway. One blinked red when I opened the curtain. I stepped outside and stared up at them. Claire stood on the steps with a mug of tea. "For your safety," she said before I could ask. "Nathan said we shouldn't take chances anymore. After your fall, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think this was love in action. The kind of care you give to aging parents without stripping their dignity." But I couldn't unhear the laughter. That night, as I lay in bed, I saw the flickering light of the camera outside my window. It blinked into the dark, watching, waiting. I began to feel like a guest in my own home. No, not a guest stand exhibit. Over the next few days, more things changed. Groceries started appearing on the kitchen counter, already put away without asking. My mail was sorted before I touched it. Claire began scheduling my doctor appointments, calling it one less thing for you to worry about. One afternoon, I overheard them in the hallway outside the bathroom. "She's clearly struggling," Nathan said in a low voice. Claire sighed. "She's just tired. She's always been independent. That was before. She could really hurt herself again. We need to think long term. Long term." Like I was a problem to be managed. Then I heard a word, never expected to enter my home. Guardianship. It landed like a brick. I pressed my hand to my chest and listened. Claire didn't argue. She didn't push back. She just murmured something I couldn't hear. And the hallway went silent. Later that week, I caught a glimpse of paperwork on the kitchen table printouts with words like power of attorney, medical proxy, and property transfer. Nothing was signed yet, but the pages had yellow sticky notes marking where I would need to. I stood there unnoticed, watching Nathan highlight a section. He looked up, startled, and smiled too quickly. "Just organizing," he said, "trying to stay ahead of the curve." The curve. That's what I'd become. A curve to manage. A variable to plan for. Protection or possession. That was the question gnawing at me now. Because there's a fine line between caring for someone and controlling them. Between showing up out of love and moving in out of motive. I thought about the laughter again. That quick, cruel sound that told me everything before the words ever came. They didn't see me as a person anymore. They saw me as paperwork. And for the first time, I realized the fall hadn't just bruised my hip. It had cracked something deeper, my illusion of family. My hope that love alone could protect legacy. I lay awake that night. The red light blinking outside my window like a slow heartbeat. Not for my safety, for theirs. The folder was thick. It had a glossy blue cover and pages neatly tabbed with sticky notes in pale yellow and pastel green. Claire set it down on the dining room table like it was a fresh-baked pie, something warm and harmless. Nathan followed behind her, holding 2 pens, one black, one blue. He smiled wide. "We thought we'd save you a trip to town. Got everything ready for you." I sat in my usual chair, my fingers curled tightly around a lukewarm mug of tea. The kind Claire had started brewing for me without asking. Chamomile always. The calm-down tea. I looked at the folder. "What is it?" "Oh, just some housekeeping," Claire said breezily. "Nothing scary. Standard stuff." Nathan flipped it open, pages fluttering like wings. Power of attorney, medical directives, property continuity. This is what responsible families do. "Mom," he said, mom like a badge he'd borrowed and was ready to hand back. My eyes skimmed the top page. Bold letters. Durable power of attorney agreement. I read the first few lines and felt my stomach twist. "Just sign here," Claire said, tapping the bottom corner. My voice caught in my throat. "I think I need my glasses." "You're fine," Nathan said, pushing the black pen toward me. "It's all straightforward. It just means if something ever happened, we could help make decisions. You know, protect you." "From what?" I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my temples. "Can we do this tomorrow?" "I'm feeling a little tired." Nathan's smile froze. Claire glanced at him, then back at me. "Of course," she said too quickly. "We just thought Wheelu'd want this settled." They exchanged a look. It was subtle, but I'd raised Claire. I knew every flicker of her eye. That look wasn't concern. It was calculation. I stood up slowly. I think I'll lie down for a bit. In my bedroom, I closed the door and locked it. Not because I was afraid, but because something in me needed distance. Not physical, but emotional. A gap wide enough to breathe in. I lay on the bed, fully clothed. And closed my eyes. I didn't sleep. I listened to their footsteps, to their whispers, to the sound of the folder being zipped into a bag and placed back on the hall table at dinner. They didn't mention the papers. Claire made pot roast, and Nathan passed the mashed potatoes like it was any other evening. But the air was too still. Every word was too polite. It felt like a script I hadn't been given. Later, I sat on the porch and watched the sky turn shades of copper and ash. My bones ached. But not from age. From betrayal. They'd handed me a pen with one hand. And erased me with the other dot, not loudly. Not cruelly. Not even intentionally, perhaps. But thoroughly, with smiles, with soft voices. With its just paperwork. As the poison in the spoon, the next morning, the folder was gone from the table. Nathan said he needed to review something with the notary. Claire said nothing. I said even less, but I did one thing. I called the neighbor. The same one who had helped me sort through old insurance papers when my husband passed. The one who used to work in a law office. The one who, most importantly, had no stake in my home or my life. Bring them over, she said. Simply, so I did. The next 48 hours would change. Everything. But even before the unraveling began, before the betrayal was named and notarized, there was one truth I now carried like armor. I didn't sign that night. And thank God I didn't. The manila folder sat in my lap like it weighed 100 pounds. I clutched it with both hands as I walked up the path to Gerald Whitman's house, the same Gerald who'd been our family's lawyer since James and I first bought the land. Back when we were more love than logic, more hope than money. The brick walkway was cracked in a few places. His mailbox leaned slightly to the left. But it all felt familiar. Safe. When I knocked, he opened the door slowly, wearing a cardigan and a look of quiet surprise. "Well, Mary Holbrook," he said, like he was reading a name off an old memory. "It's been too long." "Not long enough, apparently," I replied, holding up the folder. "I think I need a little legal clarity." He stepped aside and motioned me in. The living room smelled like books and pipe tobacco he'd quit smoking years ago. But the scent had settled into the wood like an old tenant. We sat at his round oak table by the window. He unfolded the documents carefully, one by one, as if they might bruise, if handled too roughly. I sat across from him, fingers laced together so tightly they ached for 20 minutes. He read without speaking. Just the sound of rustling pages and the occasional hum under, his breath low and concerned. Then he looked up, his brow was furrowed. His mouth, a thin line. "Mary," he said, tapping one page with his index finger, "if you had signed this, you'd be out of that house in 60 days. My heart stuttered. "What?" He turned the document toward me and pointed to a paragraph buried halfway down. Clause 1(4)(c). Eviction upon structural modification notice. It overrides the life estate. They added it to look like a minor renovation clause, but it's enforceable. Legally. It gives them the right to send you packing with 60 days. Notice under the guise of necessary work. I blinked at the words. They blurred. They told me it guaranteed I could stay there forever. He didn't respond. Just turned to the next section. This one, he continued. Grants your daughter full medical authority even above your own wishes. In emergencies and non-emergencies. And here he flipped another page. Is durable power of attorney. Gives them complete access to your finances. Bank accounts, investments, even the right to sell property on your behalf. It felt like drowning in silence. And this, he added, tapping the last page, isn't standard at all. It's a retroactive intent clause. Claims you'd verbally agreed to relinquish ownership years ago in exchange for support services. It's written in a way that could make a verbal promise seem binding. My stomach twisted. But I never said anything like that. He looked at me, stimpy and steel behind his glasses. They were counting on that not mattering. Once you signed, the burden of proof would have fallen on you. They'd have the paper trail. You'd have your word. I sat back, breath shallow. I thought they were just planning for the future, I whispered. They said they wanted to protect me. Gerald nodded slowly. That's the thing about wolves. Mary, sometimes they wear cardigans and say they're helping you cross the street. I let out a bitter laugh. Or maybe a sob. It was hard to tell. He leaned forward. What do you want to do? I stared at the stack of papers. At every clause and subclause. Every signature line waiting like a trapdoor. I want to protect myself, I said. He nodded. Then let's start with revoking anything they've already tried to file. I shook my head. I never signed a thing. Good, he said, eyes sharpening. Then we'll make sure you never need to. He gathered the documents and slid them back into the folder with care. And in that moment, something shifted. The weight I'd been carrying for weeks, the confusion, the guilt, the quiet panic began to lift, not because everything was solved, but because I wasn't alone anymore. I had someone on my side who read between the lines, who saw what I saw, that it wasn't love in those documents, it was leverage, and it had nearly rewritten my life. I stood, my legs unsteady but firm beneath me. Gerald walked me to the door. At the threshold, I turned and looked at him. He laughed when I fell. I said softly. Gerald's expression darkened. Then he underestimated you. I clutched the folder to my chest like a shield. He laughed when I fell, but the lawyer didn't laugh when I showed him the papers. I planned it like a quiet storm. No shouting. No slammed doors. Just facts, carefully folded into conversation like napkins on a table set for battle. They arrived right on time. My daughter brought blueberry muffins, her version of a peace offering. Her husband followed with that smug little nod he gave when he thought he'd already won. I had tea ready, just enough sugar to make it feel familiar. We sat around the kitchen table, where she once did math homework and spilled juice boxes, where I once taught her to knead dough and pronounce apricot. I slid the folder across the table before we eat. I said I'd like to revisit something. My daughter blinked. He raised an eyebrow. But they didn't touch the folder. I had a lawyer read through those papers, I said softly. Turns out I wasn't just signing over convenience. I was signing away control. Of my house, my health, my name, silence. He recovered first. It's not as bad as it sounds. I looked at her. You knew? She looked down. It was for your protection, Mom. I laughed, short and bitter. No, it was for your convenience. He cleared his throat. Look, you're not using most of the house anyway. We thought it'd be better managed if what? I interrupted. If I handed over the only thing I built with my bare hands and broken back? He leaned back, casual. You were just going to give it to us eventually. That sentence lit something in me. Not fire, ice. Eventually, I echoed. Not while I was still breathing. She reached for my hand. Mom, you're overreacting. We were trying to help. I pulled my hand back. Help is knocking on my door with soup when I'm sick. Help is calling to check in, not checking my bank statements. Help is love without fine print. He scoffed. You're being dramatic. I stood. This is my house, I said, voice low but steady. My name is still on that deed. And as long as it is, you don't get to erase me while I'm still alive. They didn't finish their tea. They left with the muffins, and for the first time in years, the house felt mine again. The morning after the confrontation, the house was quieter than usual. Not peaceful dash, just ... stripped. Like the silence had teeth now. It didn't hum like it used to. It hovered, watched, reminded me that even my walls had been listening to conversations I never thought I'd have in the kitchen I once danced in. I didn't cry, not anymore. There was a time I would have wept into the dishwater or buried my pain beneath the hum of chores. But that day I made tea and sat still, because stillness can be its own kind of power. Then I did what women like me rarely get to do without someone else nudging us into it. I picked up the phone and called the lawyer, not the one they recommended. Not the smiling man they said works with families like ours. No, I called Gerald, my late husband's friend, the man who handled James' will with quiet dignity and a steel backbone. The man who shook my hand at the funeral and said, "If you ever need to rewrite the story, call me." That morning, I did. He remembered my voice. "Mary," he said gently, "I was wondering when you'd come in." When I stepped into his office, the air smelled the same leather chairs, old wood, and peppermint. He motioned for me to sit. I didn't waste time. "I need to revoke some things," I said. He nodded, opened a folder. "Power of attorney." "And more," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "The will. The deed. All of it. I want to start fresh." He raised an eyebrow. "This about your daughter." I hesitated. "It's about the narrative. The story they were writing for me without me. I'm taking the pen back." He didn't ask unnecessary questions. Didn't prod. He just opened a drawer and began. First, the power of attorney. Cancelled. I watched him scribble, stamp, and date with the kind of precision that made my spine straighten. Then the healthcare directive. Removed them both. Appointed someone else, someone who once brought me soup during a snowstorm and didn't ask for anything in return. My neighbor. My friend. The will came last. The thickest file. The most delicate paper. He laid it in front of me. Blank again. Waiting. "Do you want to leave the house to your daughter?" he asked, voice neutral. I stared out the window. Across the street, a young girl was riding her bike in wobbly loops. Free, wild. Unaware of how easily love could be repackaged as leverage. "No," I said. "Not anymore," he nodded once. I named 3 people in that room. My niece, Angela, who mailed me books and handwritten letters every month just because the internet feels too cold, Ruth. My friend from church who called every Wednesday and asked about my knees. My sleep, my garden, and Lena, the young tenant downstairs who once said, "I don't know how you raised a whole family alone." You're a legend. They didn't ask me for anything. They showed up, and that, I decided, was the new currency of love. Showing up with no expectation of return. Gerald looked over my decisions. His brows lifted slightly, but he didn't object. "You sure about this?" he asked once. I met his gaze. I've never been more sure. We spent 3 hours in that room. Not just changing paperwork, but shifting legacy. Not just striking out names, but writing new ones in ink that couldn't be manipulated behind my back. He walked me through every clause, every signature, every seal. And when we were done, I sat back in the chair. My shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. "I don't just want protection," I said quietly. "I want proof." Gerald tilted his head. "Proof of what?" That I lived on my terms. That I wasn't erased while still breathing. That someone, somewhere, knew I mattered. He stood, walked to the small safe behind his desk, and placed the folder inside. Then he turned back to me. "This isn't just legal," he said. "This is historical. You're not just protecting assets, Carrie. You're reclaiming authorship." That word authorship landed in my chest like a second heartbeat. I had spent years thinking my story was written by others. First by James, then by grief, then by the demands of motherhood, and lately by those who thought my aging was a loophole to exploit. But in that room with a pen in my hand and steel in my spine, I realized something bigger. This house wasn't my only legacy. My choices were, on the way home, I stopped at a print shop, had 2 copies made of the final will. One for my records, one to frame, not to gloat, not to warn, but to remind myself I still had power. Quiet power, legal power, personal power. When I returned, the house felt different. Still old, still weathered, but no longer vulnerable. I placed one copy in the fireproof box under the stairs. The other I left on the mantel next to a photo of me and James. We were young in it. Dust on our boots. Pride in our smiles. He'd be proud of me now. Not just for surviving, but for rising. Not just for avoiding betrayal, but for rewriting the ending as I made tea that afternoon. I've passed the living room window. A car slowed outside. My daughters, they didn't stop. Just glanced at the house and kept going. I didn't flinch. They had tried to build a future by deleting my present, but they didn't realize I hadn't finished speaking yet. And now every word, every clause, every page of my life was finally mine. The house was still when I sat to write. No humming fridge, no ticking clock, just the weight of words waiting to be born. I pulled out a thick cream-colored sheet of paper. It's the kind I'd saved for Christmas letters that never got written. I uncapped my fountain pen, the same one James gave me on our 20th anniversary. I figured if I was going to write the last thing my daughter might ever read from me, it deserved ink that didn't smudge. I didn't begin with anger. I began with memory. You were born on a Tuesday. I wrote, at 3:47 in the morning. The nurse laid you in my arms and you blinked once, just once, like you were letting me know you'd seen enough already to form an opinion. I wrote about the colicky nights, the endless walks around the living room, the peanut butter sandwiches cut into stars, the first day of school when she clung to my skirt and whispered, "Don't let go." I reminded her how I worked nights at the diner and still showed up to every recital, how I skipped meals to buy her books, how the first time she said I hate you at 16, I smiled and whispered, "Good, that means I'm doing it right." Then, slowly, I let the shadow in. You started changing after you met him, I wrote. It was subtle at first. A missed call, a canceled visit, a new tone in your voice, clipped, cautious. I told myself you were just busy. That marriage made you tired. I paused, fingers tight around the pen. But then you stopped calling it home, started saying the house, then the property. And one day, you asked for the deed like it was a formality, not the foundation of my life. The ink ran for pages. I wrote about the fall, the laugh, the paperwork, the camera by the porch light that blinked like an accusation. But I didn't dwell in rage. I offered something heavier. Truth. You were the child of my body, I wrote, but not of my values. I taught you how to cook, how to save, how to speak kindly. But I could never teach you how not to see people as stepping stones. I recounted the time she called to say she got the promotion, and never asked how I was managing the stairs with my bad knee. The silence when I told her about the fever I had for 3 days. The way her husband sent the documents in a manila envelope with a sticky note that read, "Just sign. No need to read." I ended the letter with something final. Not cruel, not loud, "I'm not disowning you," I wrote. That would suggest you still hold ownership over some part of me. I'm simply releasing you. Not as punishment, but as clarity. I forgive you. And that forgiveness is the last thing I'll ever give you. I folded the letter in thirds, slipped it into an envelope, wrote her name in the handwriting she used to imitate as a little girl. Then I placed it on the mantel. Next, to the photo of us at the Grand Canyon, before things soured, before distance grew into a wall, before love got buried under the convenience of betrayal. She came 2 days later. I wasn't home. I made sure of that. She used the key I hadn't revoked yet. Let herself in. I imagined she wandered, unsure whether she was still welcome. I imagined she saw the framed will on the wall and paused. Then I imagined her eyes landed on the letter. I don't know if she cried. I don't know if she read it all at once, or if she folded it closed halfway through, unwilling to finish the truth. But I do know this. She hasn't come back, and I am not grieving, because that letter wasn't written to get her back. It wasn't a plea dot. It was the full stop at the end of a sentence that had dragged on too long. Later that week, Lena, the tenant from downstairs, brought me fresh sourdough and asked if I wanted to watch her new favorite show. We sat in the living room and laughed until my ribs hurt. I glanced at the mantel once. At the empty space where the letter had been, it wasn't absence I felt. It was peace, and it echoed louder than any apology ever could. The house creaked just as it always had, same floorboard by the hall closet. Same soft groan when the wind shifted through the trees out back. But somehow it sounded different now. Not haunted. Not hesitant. Just free. For the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't flinch when I turned the key in the front door. I didn't wonder who had walked through it with ill intent. I didn't worry if someone had replaced my name with their own behind my back, because now my name was not just on the mailbox or the birthday cards or the bills. It was still proudly legally on the deed, and that meant everything. I started over, not by moving, but by reclaiming every square inch of the life I had nearly lost. It began quietly. Ruth came first, my church friend of over 20 years. Her own house had become too lonely after her sister passed, and she was weary of silence. When I offered her the guest room, she cried. We moved her in on a Sunday afternoon with just 2 suitcases and a potted fern named Oliver. That night, we had soup and old hymns on the radio. She laughed like someone who hadn't laughed in months. And I realized neither had I. Then came Lena, a young woman who rented the small basement apartment. She was quiet, respectful, always left flowers on the kitchen table when I least expected them. She once told me, "Your home feels like a place where women heal." I didn't tell her that it hadn't always, but I was glad it did now. Angela followed a month later. My niece, my brother's daughter, the one they always called too sensitive or too dreamy. She painted, she hummed while she worked. She drank tea out of mugs twice the size of her face and wrote poems on napkins. She had once been told she wasn't practical enough. But here, in these walls, she bloomed. We called ourselves the Porch Ladies every evening. Like clockwork, we sat outside with quilts and hot mugs, waving at neighbors and whispering secrets we hadn't shared in years. We weren't family by blood, but we were family by choice, and that mattered more. The rooms that had once echoed with suspicion now buzzed with warmth. Ruth played hymns on the piano in the living room. Angela painted sunflowers on the wall by the laundry door. Lena installed a tiny birdhouse just outside the kitchen window. And me, I planted roots, not new ones, but deeper ones. One afternoon, as spring tiptoed back into Kentucky with her pink skies and wet winds, I stood in the backyard, staring at the patch of dirt where James and I had once tried and failed to grow tomatoes. It had gone wild since, but now it was time. We started the legacy garden that weekend. It wasn't grand, just for raised beds, a painted sign, and a circle of women with dirty gloves and hopeful eyes. Ruth chose rosemary for remembrance, she said. As she pressed the tiny sprigs into the soil, her fingers trembled, but her heart was steady. Angela chose daffodils. Because they come back, she smiled. Even when it snows too long, I knew exactly what she meant. Lena chose lavender. For peace, she whispered. Real peace. Not the kind where people stop talking, but the kind where they finally speak truth. And I chose marigolds. Not because they were pretty, but because they thrived in hard soil. We didn't talk much as we planted. We didn't need to. The air said everything. The sign we hung read, rooted, not replaced. Underneath a garden for women who were almost forgotten. People started visiting. Women from town. Some alone. Some with daughters who held their hands too tight or not at all. Some came with seeds. Others came just to cry. We never asked why. We just made space. Inside the house, we framed more than family photos. We framed stories. Angela made a wall of honor near the staircase. Mothers who refused to disappear. It was full of handwritten quotes from women who had taken back their homes. Their names, their peace. The staircase had never looked so powerful, and above it, at the end of the hallway. Right where the light from the afternoon window hit just right was the title deed, framed in gold, centered, unapologetic. It wasn't for vanity. It was for visibility. Because when you've almost been erased, the first thing you want to do is remind yourself and the world that you are still here. I walked that hallway every night, barefoot, hand brushing the frame like a prayer. I didn't need to read it anymore. I knew every letter, but touching it reminded me that survival is not always loud. Sometimes it's as quiet as keeping your name in print. My daughter never came back. Not really. There were a few texts. A call once, but I never heard the words I needed to hear. And maybe that was the closure I got. Not a reunion, not forgiveness, but the right to choose who enters my story. And still, I didn't carry hate, only distance. boundaries written in ink and peace. I remember the first night I truly exhaled. It was late. The stars were out and the porch light flickered like it always had. I sat alone for a moment, just me and the wind. I looked at the framed deed through the window and whispered, "You almost lost this." And then I smiled, because almost doesn't count in court. The house was safe. The will was changed. The power of attorney revoked. The garden was blooming, and my name. Still on the deed, still on the mailbox, still in the story. I wasn't a guest in my own life. Anymore, I was the author. And as the breeze rustled the curtains, I stood and walked back inside, slow, steady. Shoulders squared. He had laughed when I fell. But when I rose, paper in hand, name intact, no one dared laugh again.